Our first speaker is going to be Conor Cogswell, and he will be presenting a paper on the Chisholm Trail and Texas fever, how the U.S. Department of Agriculture discovered diseases can be infectious, but not contagious. Conor?
John correctly gave the title of my talk, but it's not what I started out to do. I started out to do a talk on the Chisholm Trail and the myth of the American cowboy. Being a young tweener or teener when Rawhide came out, my favorite show, on 8 to 9 every Friday night. But the more I learned about the Chisholm Trail, which is basically the trail from Texas to the railheads in Kansas, Missouri, to markets in the east to Chicago, the backstory was that the trail shifted. It kept shifting west. Kept shifting west. And you can look at the map. Sedalia is the only time, I believe, the Rawhide episode where they got to the railhead was Sedalia. That is factually incorrect because, as you remember, Clint Eastwood, portraying Rowdy Yates, was an ex-Civil War soldier. And Missouri was off limits to Texas cattle for after 1858. So anyway, you go Sedalia, Abilene, Newton, who ever heard of Newton? Wichita, Caldwell, Ellsworth, finally Dodge City. And that's why Janet Oellig is here tonight to tell you about Dodge City. Had Texas fever not been around, they would have gone to Sedalia every year, and it's closer to Kansas City, it's closer to St. Louis, it's closer to rails, and Janet would not be able to give you a talk tonight. So that's the story here. And that became the more interesting story, why the trail kept shifting, and then why the trail kept shifting, and then it stopped. There's really only a 20-year history. The myth of the American cowboy and the Chisholm Trail really lasted for about 20 years, 1865 to 1885, and it's over. And Clint Eastwood would not be where he is today if there was no Chisholm Trail. So, and then the more interesting story came out with the Department of Agriculture. And since we are going through pandemics and whatever, they had the Texas fever was greatly debated as to what caused it, what it was, and the Department of Agriculture answered the question. And with pretty much significant results. For instance, malaria would not have been cured, or they wouldn't have identified malaria, the cause of the malaria, until they figured out the cause of the Texas fever. So you just have to wait. So anyway, I will now give my talk. In April 28th, 1874, this is early on, the Denison, Texas Daily News ran a story about Texas cattle headed north to Kansas on the quote, the famous Chisholm Trail. That's the first reference to it. That's the first, but at least, newspaper people can embellish things, but it was a famous Chisholm Trail in 1874. This is the first reference to the cattle trail, named after Indian trading post operator Jesse Chisholm. And it's very curious. Before the Civil War, Chisholm, who was half Cherokee, he operated the largest Indian trading post in Oklahoma, and during the war supplied Confederate forces with food and munitions. In 1864, he opened a second trading post near Wichita, Kansas. And in 1865, he opened a wagon trail connecting his two trading posts. So you can look at the map and you can see Wichita, and Oklahoma City didn't exist at the time, but I put an X where it is, and it's maybe 150 miles. But when he died, in 1864, and in 1865 he opened a wagon trail connecting the two trading posts. But when he died in March 1868, barely 6 months after the first boxcar of cattle left Abilene for Chicago, he had never trailed a herd of Texas cattle anywhere, let alone to Kansas. So it is unclear why this trail from Fort Worth, Texas to Abilene, Kansas bore his name. Adding to the confusion, by 1900, other cattle trails, principally the Shawnee Trail, which is identified on the map, and the Western Trail, were conflated by Western raconteurs and cowboy reminiscers with the Chisholm Trail. So much so that by 1910, any cattle trail from the Rio Grande to Kansas was popularly known as the Chisholm Trail. So anything from Texas to Kansas became known as the Chisholm Trail. This paper is not about how these several cattle trails became known as the Chisholm Trail, which is a topic hotly debated in Texas to this day. But why this Chisholm Trail from 1865 to 1890 steadily shifted its destinations west, first from Sedalia, Missouri, to Abilene, then to Ellsworth, and finally Dodge City, is the subject of this paper. The first of the three trails was the Shawnee Trail, and that was roughly from 1846 to 1856, and it's the one on the map there that goes to Sedalia. It's the farthest one east. During its heyday, it trailed over 500,000 head of cattle. Next was the Chisholm Trail, mentioned in the Daily News, from San Antonio to Abilene and other central Kansas railheads. And that's roughly 1867 to 1875. That famous Chisholm Trail trailed over 2 million head of cattle. And finally, the Western Trail from West Texas to Dodge City, Kansas, 1876 to 1884, over which there were trailed 5 million head of cattle. That's a lot of steak. All three trails live on today in our cowboy myths, but all had short lives as cattle trails, less than 10 years each. The 1960s TV show Rawhide, starring a young Clint Eastwood, had a longer on-air life than any of these destinations did as cow towns. The reason for their brief lives was Texas fever. In the days of the Texas Republic, any trailing along the Shawnee Trail involved small herds of 100 to 200 head. But in 1846, Edward Piper changed the metric. He trailed 1,000 head of cattle from Texas to Sedalia, Missouri. After that, herds of cattle headed for Missouri railheads frequently had over 3,000 steers. This led to armed confrontations with Missouri farmers who resented this importation into their home state of what they regarded as diseased cattle. In the first reported incident, a group of armed Missouri farmers in 1853 confronted a Texas drover, the guy driving the cattle, with 3,000 head and blocked his passage. By 1855, every western Missouri county had a, quote, vigilance committee that met any and all Texas trail bosses at the county line. If the Texan refused to reverse course, the vigilance committee returned at nightfall to shoot and or stampede the cattle. The farmers became vigilantes because they believed they were victims. The American law of open range gave cattlemen the right to trail cattle to market over a farmer's property, unless the farmer fenced his property. Even a posted no trespassing sign, absent a fence, had no legal significance. Texas drovers could and did graze their herds in farmers' pastures and forage their crops. Barbed wire would not be available for another 20 years. And in 1855, with little wood or stone available, fencing a prairie farm meant a ditch or a mud wall. Both were laborious and often ineffective. So in 1855, under pressure from the local farmers, Missouri banned Texas cattle from entering the state, except in the winter. And this plays out throughout. They're banned except in the winter. Under penalty of a $1,000 fine and forfeiture of the cattle. Not only will you fine, but the cattle you were bringing there, you forfeited. That left the Texas drovers little choice but to trail their cattle north to southeast Kansas. At the time, that solution was short-lived because Kansas enacted a similar law in 1858. The Missouri and Kansas farmers' objection to Texas cattle was founded on a conviction that Texas cattle were diseased, and the contagion they carried infected their local cattle. The basis for the farmers' suspicions was, except in winter, whenever Texas beeves, that's what they call them, beeves, passed through their community, their own livestock became sick and often died. The Texas longhorns themselves, however, were asymptomatic and healthy. So it was difficult to explain how the longhorns spread a disease they apparently did not have. It was a further mystery how the contagion was spread from the supposedly infected Texas cattle to the healthy local cattle, when often the only contact the herds had was grazing in the same pasture weeks apart. The local farmers had two explanations, both involving a belief the Texas cattle were somehow immune to disease they carried. The first was the longhorns ate poisonous plants that showed up in their waste, which was fatal to any local cattle that came into contact with it. There was no evidence, however, any such poisonous plants existed. The second explanation involved ticks that Texas cattle brought with them. They theorized the longhorn ticks attached to local cattle and thereby spread the disease. Such a theory was fanciful at the time because both American and European scientists believed it impossible for an arthropod, such as a tick, that is a word, Janet has checked it for me, it is a word, but spiders are also arthropods, I believe. An arthropod, such as a tick, to be a vector, it's It's a new word for me too, but that's an intermediary for disease. If the Missouri and Kansas quarantine laws of the 1850s did not kill the market for Texas beef before the Civil War, because we're not at the Civil War yet, the Civil War did. And at the war's conclusion in 1865, there were 6 million longhorns, 6 million, mostly feral, roaming the Texas ranges, 10 cows for every Texan. There was 600,000. Texas had a population of 600,000. You got 6 million longhorns there. There was so much supply and so little demand, Texas steers went for $1 to $2 in Texas. As one observer noted, you could tell how impoverished a Texas rancher was by the size of his herd. The bigger the herd, the poorer the rancher. So if in California a steer fetched $100, and during the gold rush days it did, and in Chicago $60, there was plenty of incentive to get these beeves to those markets. Desperate to market their cattle, Texans tried navigating the Louisiana swamps for New Orleans. Others braved the Comanches, seeking to supply U.S. Army forts in New Mexico and Colorado. And if you look at the map, the Goodnight Loving Trail is really not a trail for railheads for north and east. It's a trail for Army forts. A lot of Army forts over there. In Mexico, Kansas repealed its quarantine law in 1866. And a few adventuresome ranchers tempted fate, and the Missouri Vigilantes seeking markets in Missouri and in eastern Kansas. Most Texas ranchers, however, stayed home in 1866. Clint Eastwood and the American cowboy would not be the cultural icons they are today, but for Chicago businessman Joseph G. McCoy. McCoy saw the difficulty of getting Texas cattle to northern markets as a business challenge with a huge payoff. Wheeler dealer, non-parial, he knew how to skirt the rules, close the deal, and keep everybody happy. First, he persuaded the Kansas Pacific Railroad to build a spur track to Abilene. Mind you, the Kansas Pacific at this point, they're building the Transcontinental Railroad, so they're heading west. And they went a spur track to Abilene, Kansas, then a hamlet of 10 log cabins with mud roofs. In this unlikely setting, he planned to bring together Texas cattlemen and Chicago buyers. The railroad, desperate for freight, and they're spending all this money building the track and everything, they need to carry something, promised McCoy a commission for every steer that was shipped out of Abilene. There was one problem. After the railroad committed to Abilene, Kansas reenacted its quarantine law and drew the line beyond which Texas cattle could not cross under penalty of fine and forfeiture. And it was in the middle of the state. Abilene was just inside the quarantine law. McCoy, knowing Abilene to be practically uninhabited, persuaded, we wonder how, Kansas officials to look the other way. He did this by leasing local pasture lands and posting a $20,000 bond, guaranteeing indemnity for any harm local farmers suffered. He scrupulously kept his word, paying out over $5,000 in the first year. Legend has it, he is the source of the phrase, the real McCoy. I should emphasize legend, because the source of that information was a vodka ad in the 1960s. Cowboy history began in March 1867, when McCoy purchased 500 acres in Abilene at $5 an acre, on which he constructed a 175-room hotel, a livery stable for 100 horses and carriages, along with stockyards, chutes, and scales. Remember, there were only 10 log cabins there before. He had available sites for saloons, dance halls, and gambling joints, but he did not own or operate any of those. He then sent sales teams to Texas to tell the cattlemen to follow the new wagon trail connecting Jesse Chisholm's Indian trading posts in Oklahoma City and Wichita. There they could utilize the McCoy Trail that he had blazed from Wichita to Abilene without vigilante or legal problems. Knowing what Texans wanted to hear, he promised top dollar for their beeves. To deliver on this promise, he had to get Chicago buyers there. To that end, he spent $5,000 in newspaper advertisements promising Illinois buyers a plentiful supply of Texas cattle in Abilene. Showman P.T. Barnum had nothing on Joseph G. McCoy. McCoy famously chartered rail cars, seemingly laden with longhorns, headed for Chicago, with placards on the sides touting the supply of beeves in Abilene. The rail cars actually contained buffaloes. With the chief market destination being Chicago, McCoy had to evade Illinois' prohibition against importing Texas cattle. Illinois waived this prohibition upon McCoy's certification. The cattle shipped from Abilene to Chicago had wintered in Kansas. Remember, winter is the thing that there is no risks, they believed. This certification must have looked very suspicious the following year when the English journal Veterinarian reported in its June 1868 issue, quote, "A very subtle and terribly fatal disease," end quote, had broken out among cattle in Illinois. Mm-hmm. On September 5th, 1867, the first Texas Longhorns shipped from Abilene to Chicago. By year end, this is by end of 1867, and only in 4 months' time, 35,000 head had shipped out. In 1868, 75,000 were shipped. And in 1869 and 1870, both years, 150,000 head of cattle were shipped out of Abilene. Cattlemen such as Lyndon Johnson's grandfather Sam were making so much money they were blinded to the fact that where returns are so great, the market will quickly get crowded. And in 1871, 600,000 head of cattle were trailed to Abilene. Wow. The supply far exceeded the demand and prices collapsed. Only 40,000 were shipped that year. Wow. Many cattlemen like Sam Johnson bet prices would recover and kept their cattle on the range over the winter. Prices fell further and he lost everything. And if you read Robert Caro's biography, which is 4 volumes on LBJ, LBJ and his father, he was not his idol. His idol was his grandfather. And anyway, so prices fell further, and with the open range so crowded with Texas steers, Kansas officials had to enforce the ban against Texas cattle. The 1870 bus ended Abilene's days as a big-time Texas cow town. What was it, 4 years? It's about all it was, 67, 68, 69, and 70. So in 1871, McCoy moved 60 miles west and built similar facilities outside the quarantine line in Ellsworth, Kansas. As the quarantine line changed with each wave of new settlers, that's the whole thing, new settlers are coming with their cattle, other Kansas cattle markets popped up. Like the arcade game Whack-A-Mole. After Abilene died, Newton appears in 1871, only to be replaced by Wichita in 1873, with Caldwell supplanting Wichita in 1874. Ellsworth survived until 1876. The same year, the Red River War, which lasted from 1874 to 1876, ended the Comanche threat in the Texas Panhandle and West Texas. So if you look at the map, the Panhandle was off limits because the Comanches were there. That was, with the Comanches pacified, Texas ranchers could now avoid the local sheriff and barbed wire by taking their cattle 125 miles west of Ellsworth to Dodge City, Kansas, on what was then called the Western Trail that Texas cattleman John T. Lytle had blazed in 1874. The westward push of settlers, however, continued unabated. By 1883, barbed wire was in mass production, and I believe the Carnegie Brothers Steel Company was a big manufacturer of barbed wire. That coupled with Missouri, Kentucky, Kansas, look at the map here, Missouri, Kentucky, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, California, Wyoming, and Illinois, all imposing restrictions on when and where Texas cattle could be trailed. This was a bad omen for the cowboys. Like the shadow of a setting sun, the quarantine line moves steadily west and south. The end for Dodge came first in early 1885, when Kansas banned Texas cattle throughout the entire state, except in the winter, and that was followed by the severe winter of 1886 to 1887. Ranchers called it the Great Die-Up, because when they went out for the 1887 spring roundup, they found only carcasses. Many ranchers, like future President Theodore Roosevelt, quit being cattle raisers speculators at that time. Texans viewed the quarantine laws targeting Texas cattle as their chief threat. And they, like any other good red-blooded American, asked Congress for help. They wanted a national trail under the supervision of the federal government created. Seeking federal intervention, however, ultimately backfired, because the unseen threat to their business model were changes in the cattle market itself and not in the state's regulations. American taste now favored the beefier English stock over the Spanish Longhorn. Plus, many Midwestern ranchers on the open range now favored English beef stock because the English beeves were fully matured in half the time it took a Longhorn to grow. Basically 1 year. You'd get an English cattle in 1 year time, they were fully grown. The Longhorn, it was much bigger, but it took 2 years to get there. Seeing this opening in the cattle market, Eastern investors and capitalists rushed to invest in cattle ranching, feeding their livestock on the free grass of the open ranges of the Great Plains in the Dakotas, Montana, and Wyoming. Teddy Roosevelt was one. Teddy Roosevelt went on a hunting trip in 1883 and caught the bug, gushing open range ranching was the pleasantest, healthiest, and most exciting phase of American existence. Now, he did engage in hyperbole, but this is clearly he was very impressed. His Elkhorn Ranch in the Black Hills of South Dakota is a national park today. These eastern tenderfoots jealously regarded their idyllic existence against diseased Texas cattle. Like the Texans, they wanted federal intervention, but they wanted and got national regulation, not a national trail. In May of 1884, Congress took the first step toward federal regulation by creating the Bureau of Animal Industry. Its first director was the Department of Agriculture's head of veterinary medicine, Dr. Daniel E. Salmon. He was charged with conducting scientific research on farm animal diseases and issuing interstate transportation regulations. Salmon studied the relation between farm animal diseases and geography. His data demonstrated higher incidences of disease among swine, poultry, horses, and cattle in the southern states than in the northern ones. He drew a line, essentially the 38th parallel, which interestingly is what separates North and South Korea, essentially the 38th parallel from the Atlantic Ocean through Virginia to the Rockies, marking the boundary between areas where farm diseases were absent and where prevalent. Texas fever was one of the first diseases he tracked, and his research convinced him Texas cattle could not be transported across the imaginary line where they were likely to infect healthy cattle without federal regulations in place. We should note that even today, the actual extent of the Texas fever problem remains unclear because both eastern ranchers and local farmers had competitive reasons unrelated to livestock health to want Texas cattle to remain in Texas. Dr. Salmon, however, knew the health issues required federal action. Before he could issue and enforce regulations against Texas cattle, he needed answers to three questions. What is causing this disease? How is it spread? And why does the contagion of Texas cattle disappear in the winter? With the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Bureau of Animal Industry up and running, Dr. Salmon began his search for answers in the summer of 1884. He staffed the Bureau with three recent Cornell University graduates, Theobald Smith, a microscopist, I guess that means he's looking at things under the microscope, who was tasked with identifying the pathogen causing the disease. Frederick L. Kilbourne, an experimental scientist, was to determine the correlation, if any, between the spread of disease and the prevalence of ticks on the Texas cattle. And biologist Cooper Curti was charged to study and report on the life cycle of this particular tick. Scientists of the day ridiculed Salmon for listening to laymen like the Kansas farmers' ideas that ticks played any role in the spread of the disease. He never studied in Europe, but Theobald Smith, he was a microscopist, was familiar with the bacterial investigations and techniques of European scientists such as Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, and Paul Ehrlich. Using this familiarity, he studied bovine pleuropneumonia, hog cholera, multiplex swine plaque, these don't sound good, and Texas fever. The Texas fever research was hampered by its disappearance in the winter. Nevertheless, in 1886, Smith first noted microscopic, quote, small round bodies in the red corpuscles of a diseased cow. By 1888, he had positively identified a protozoan parasite. Now, John can tell us there's a difference between a protozoa and a bacteria. These are different things, right? So anyway, this is a single cell parasite he named Pleurosoma Bigeminum. Sounds like big minimum, but anyway, bigemin. I suppose it means something in Latin. As a single cell pathogen that feeds off the host cow's red blood cells. It was later renamed Babesia bigeminum, and the disease today is known as babiosis. Smith then confirmed his suspicion that the apparently healthy Texas cattle were actually infected with babiosis, but so moderately they were asymptomatic. Next, it was Frederick L. Kilbourne's task to determine what role, if any, cattle ticks played in the spread of the disease. He placed disease-free northern cattle and diseased Texas cattle with ticks in the same corral for 2 weeks. Within 30 days, the northern cattle tested positive for babiosis. Then he took the same diseased Texas cattle and meticulously removed all the ticks from their bodies before putting them in the same corral with a new herd of healthy northern cattle. The test came back negative, indicating no transmission of the Babesia protozoa to the healthy northern cattle. The vector of the disease had to be the ticks, but how? There are over 700 different species of ticks. Really, one's enough, but there are 700 different species. For our purposes, there are just two important distinguishing traits. Number one is host preference, and number two, number of hosts in a life cycle. The specific tick on the Texas cattle was a Bophilis annulatus. It prefers only cattle, and during its life has only one host. Ticks have 4 life cycle stages: eggs, larva, nymphs, and adult. The transition from larva to nymphs and nymphs to adult normally involves molting, but not here. Most ticks change hosts after molting, but Cooper Curtice discovered the Bophilis does not. The Bophilis eggs hatch on the ground and the larva attached to the legs of a steer. Every Bophilis tick then remains with that host steer for the rest of its life. So if it stays with one host the rest of its life, how does it infect the healthy steer? As it turns out, it doesn't. Its progeny does. Before the female leaves her host to lay her eggs and die, she mates with a male tick and engorges herself on the host's infected blood, increasing in size tenfold. After dropping to the ground and laying 25 to 4,000 eggs, she dies. After the eggs hatch, the larvae already carrying the microscopic Babesia protozoa begin the process anew. During the winter months, ticks are dormant. They don't mate, reproduce, or lay eggs. That explains why the Texas cattle, while diseased themselves, do not spread the disease in the winter months. The United States Department of Agriculture published a monograph by Smith and Kilbourne in 1893 titled Investigations into the Nature, Causation, and Prevention of Texas or Southern Cattle Fever. Most scientists in both the US and Europe greeted its publication cautiously, if not skeptically. But the documentation was so complete, no one could rebut it. Within 10 years, this government research by these federal employees led directly to scientists worldwide identifying mosquitoes as the vector for malaria and yellow fever, and lice for typhus. Historian Ulysses G. Houck said of the discovery, quote, "For the first time in history, it was proved conclusively that the essential factor of an infectious disease may be a microparasite that reaches the victims only through an intermediate host, and this revealed how a truly infectious disease may in no respect be contagious." What Salmon, Smith, and Kilbourne and Curtis could not explain, and never did, was why the diseased Texas longhorns, except those from the Texas Panhandle, were asymptomatic. The answer to that mystery had to wait until modern times and a better understanding of immune systems. Cattle at birth have a partial immunity to many diseases, including Texas fever. This natural immunity provides a protection, but only for a few months. The calf of a diseased mother has the extra protection long enough for its autoimmune system to recognize the Babesia pathogen and start producing an antibody. The calf grows into adulthood diseased, but the Babesia pathogen is held in check by the cow's own internal immune system. If, however, a disease-free cow, like a panhandle longhorn, contracts to babesia as an adult, its immune system, unlike the calf's, is overwhelmed before it can produce antibodies to combat the babesia. Not coincidentally, the last Texas cattle trail through Kansas was in the winter of 1893, the year of the Smith and Kilbourne monograph. The Bureau of Animal Industry, now with answers to the three questions Dr. Salmon posed, issued and enforced regulations dealing with transportation of southern cattle across state lines. The regulations required all southern cattle be transported in separate boxcars and upon arrival at their destination, housed in separate stockyards. The department developed an arsenic-based dip that, when applied every 2 weeks, killed the ticks, and it did not harm the cattle. In 1956, mind you, this is 60 plus years later, the Department of Agriculture finally declared the United States babesiosis free. In closing, I would like to share a humorous story about the Bureau of Animal Industry's historic discovery. Theobald Smith largely authored, he was a microscopist, he largely authored the 1893 monograph. But his boss, Daniel E. Salmon, insisted co-worker Fred Kilbourne, who made the discovery about the ticks, receive equal authorial credit. Smith objected, but Salmon insisted. Feeling slighted, Smith left the Bureau for academia shortly thereafter. During his tenure at the Bureau of Animal Industry, Smith had studied hog cholera and other swine-related intestinal diseases. By 1900, he's now in academia, it was evident to scientists that Smith, while studying these diseases, was the first to identify the diseases, the pathogen that causes extreme abdominal pain and diarrhea in humans. As such, he was asked to name the genus. In honor of his former boss, he named it Salmonella. And in case anyone's interested, it was largely thought that humans were immune. I think they are. But in the 1960s, there was a reported death of babesiosis in a human. It's the only one on record. It's the only one on record. So it's kind of unusual.
There truly was no law enforcement or any type of government in Dodge City during its first year of existence from 1872 to 1873. A railroad town like Dodge City was bound to be a magnet for all types of people of questionable character, and Dodge City quickly earned its dangerous reputation. The worst of Dodge City's brutality in its early years came from the gamblers who were attracted to the town. All the dance halls and saloons provided gambling. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars passed across the gaming tables. Professional gunslingers were drawn to Dodge for the same reason that the town attracted gamblers, outlaws, rustlers, thieves, and ladies of easy virtue. Loose money abounded and victims were plentiful. A man could hire out his gun for a sizable fee, and if he received no offers, he could make a living at faro or poker, for fingers so expert on the trigger were also adept at dealing aces from the bottom of the deck. In an emergency, a deputy's badge would be pinned on his shirt, and he could earn money by turning on his own kind. His reputation preceded him, passing like wildfire down the chain of cowtowns strung along the Arkansas. Yet he was not regarded as the hunted criminal as long as he observed the gunman's code. If he was obliged to kill a man for professional reasons, he provoked a situation where they both met face to face and in the open, making sure his adversary was prepared and armed. Then he relied on the advantage of the fast draw. If he killed his opponent with the first shot, and he often did, he was rarely convicted of murder or even brought to trial, for the gunman made sure there were ample witnesses to testify that it was a fair fight, an exchange of shots, hence no one was to blame. And the trains brought newspaper reporters as well who wrote stories of the city's lawlessness, perhaps punching up the stories a bit for the readers back east who just couldn't get enough. Those tales have lingered and formed into legends and have become the lasting reputation of Dodge City, true or not. Dodge City had been declared the official name in October 1872, but because it was not yet an incorporated city, it could not have an appointed or elected peace officer. The people of the town passed the hat and hired themselves a marshal, and that was Billy Brooks. Brooks' lawman strategy was to shoot them before they could shoot him. During his first 30 days, he killed or wounded at least a dozen men. His time in Dodge City was short. Next, in 1873, the town formed a society of vigilantes, which worked for a time, but as it was explained later, the problem was hard, bad men kept creeping in and joining until they outnumbered the men who had joined it for the public good. When they felt themselves in power, they proceeded to use that power to avenge their own grievances until it was a farce as well as an outrage on common decency. The arrival in Dodge of Wyatt Earp in May 1876 marked the beginning of an era in that city's efforts to keep law and order within bounds. A new era, for that matter, in the struggle to bring law to the entire West. This is not giving Earp himself undue importance. His action-packed career has often been exaggerated by himself as well as by others. But as assistant marshal under Marshal Larry Dager, he topped a long list of marshals and sheriffs that were outstanding in the West and in Dodge. Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan Earp, brothers to each other. Bat Jim and Ed Masterson, again, brothers to each other. Charlie Bassett, Billy Tillman, Mysterious Dave Mather, and Ham Bell, to name a few. They were difficult figures to pigeonhole. It was sometimes uncertain which side of the law they represented, and often they represented both. Many of them came from other cow towns that had passed their prominence. Abilene, Texas, and Wichita, Ellsworth, Hayes, and Newton, Kansas. Appointments to office were often based on urgent necessity rather than on a careful canvassing of recruits, with on-the-spot selections made in moments of emergency. The only qualification was skill in handling a gun. There was no time or inclination to examine a man's past or principles, so no vetting of prospects. After Earp was hired, he hired a half dozen other officers, one of which was his old friend from his buffalo hunting days, Bat Masterson. Wyatt Earp is the one on the bottom. He's 28, and Bat is 23, the one on the left. Earp was taciturn, a teetotaler, a gambler, and was very sure of himself. Masterson, also tough, was a good storyteller and very charming, but was no stranger to drink or the gaming tables. Earp established guidelines for his deputies that discouraged deadly force. Officers were to avoid violence and to first try to reason with wrongdoers. If men were talking, they weren't shooting, he reasoned. If the lawman needed to shoot, he was to wound, not kill. Earp often buffaloed the offender, and buffaloing, when it looked like a confrontation could get violent, the lawman would strike first by hitting the dumbfounded cowboy, gambler, or run-of-the-mill drunk over the top of the head with the barrel of his gun. The unconscious cowboy would recover, either in jail or in a saloon, where he could resume being free with his money. This kept down the mortality and certainly allowed for more repeat customers in the saloons. Earp was especially good at this because he was 6 feet tall, much taller than most men at the time. Earp got $2.50 for each person he jailed, which added to his base wage of $250 a month, which was a very nice wage. As a result of their policing over the next 3 years, gun violence in Dodge fell, but arrests rose to about 300 a month. They also were able to implement new laws, such as no one could ride their horse into a dance hall or saloon. I think some men like to drink with their horses, I don't know. Intending to restore order, one of the first things the new lawman did was to enforce a deadline, which was Front Street, respectability to the north, far less than respectable to the south. The city passed an ordinance that guns could not be worn or carried in the town except in your own home. might be able to see, it says about firearms, we had to turn them in. And then we get an ad here, try prickly ash bitters, which I Googled that, I didn't know what that was. It's a type of medicine, a remedy for, I guess, blood out of ship.
Oellig Pharmacy.
Yeah, they could have been Doctors Oellig Sturm Vegetable Tonic and Blood Purifier, yes. But we weren't that far west. They had to leave their weapons with the bartender or the law officer. They would be given a token to redeem them on their way out of town. The gun-toting rule was in effect around the clock, and anyone wearing a gun was immediately jailed. Soon the Dodge City jail was filled. Urban Masterson and their fellow lawmen didn't clean up Dodge City so much as to make it safe enough for the permanent citizens as well as the cattle trade and the sinful businesses that operated there. Over the next few years, Urban Masterson periodically left and returned to Dodge. They tried their fortunes in other cities in gambling, saloon owners, prospectors, and more lawing. The two would reunite briefly in Dodge City in 1883 to participate in the Dodge City War, which along with others formed the Dodge City Peace Commission. It was a political war about enforcement or banning of prostitution in the saloons. A compromise was reached and no blood was shed. The most lasting thing to come out of it was a nice group picture of the commission. This one's Herb, and that's that master. You can always pick him out. He always wore a bowler. You can see nobody else. Well, I guess that guy's a bowler maybe. But that's that, and that's why. There's many, many characters. I just don't have time to talk about them all. Buffalo hunters had nearly wiped out the buffalo by the time the 18 SF reached Dodge City. Some were killed for their hide, but many were also killed for sport, bringing the animal to the brink of extinction after nearly 40 million buffalo, and these numbers vary greatly because it was very hard to really determine how many there were, roamed the plains just 2 or 3 decades earlier. But still, in its first 3 months after reaching Dodge, the Santa Fe shipped more than 43,000 hides, worth about $100,000 and 1.5 million pounds of meat, including buffalo tongues, which was considered a delicacy, to Chicago and New York. From 1872 to 1874, 2 million hides were shipped from Dodge via the Santa Fe, along with 3 million pounds of meat. By 1876, most of the buffalo were gone, and the business was finished. The cattle drives and cowboys replaced the buffalo hunters as contributors to the Dodge City economy. By the spring of 1876, the cattle trade had shifted west from Ellsworth and Wichita, Kansas to Dodge City, because of Texas fever, which Conor told us about. When the 18SF ordered the essential holding pens to be built by the railroad yards, the destination was now Dodge City. During the next 10 years, over 5 million head were driven on the trail into Dodge City. But the cowboys brought their own lawlessness to Dodge. They came to town whiskey-thirsty and women-hungry. There was little relaxation or amusement on the trail. Drinking was not allowed, and gambling was no temptation because they had no wages until the end of the trail and their work was done. The arriving herds were preceded by their owner ranchers and by buyers and speculators from the Midwestern and Eastern cities. They holed up at Deacon Cox's new Dodge House or Bob Wright's Hotel and spent their waiting afternoons at the Long Branch or Alhambra, engaging in preliminary bickering on the forthcoming sale. They were in no hurry. For every owner, this was the only trail drive of the year, and since the cattle were sold by weight, it was well to let them graze for a while on the neighboring prairies. Some disreputable owners made sure their cattle had lots of salt and water to add to their weight. Once the cattle were settled in their holding pens, the cowboys headed to town. After 3 months on the trail through heat, dust, rain, wind, rivers, Indians, cattle rustlers, overturned chuck wagons, dwindling rations, and stampedes, no city seemed more welcoming than that sprawling, shabby city on the plains. Andy Adams, one-time Texas cowboy who made these drives in his 20s, described what happened next. First bathed and shaved, then drinks and dinner Delmonicos or the Wright House, followed by a sampling of the dance halls and gambling saloons, where most of them parted with their earnings. Next, the inevitable fistfight at the bar, followed by forcible ejection by the bouncer, and finally an angry return to the saloon with reinforcements to obtain revenge. This consisted of pistol whipping the bouncer, shooting out the lights, and generally wrecking the establishment, and was followed by a galloping retreat down Front Street with more unruly citizens taking pot shots at them on the general principle that fleeing cowboys were legitimate, inviting targets on the streets of Dodge. Usually after one night in the town, his wages were spent. And they often were there for a week, so you have one night of fun and then you're back to doing nothing. No western city or town was complete without its saloons, gambling establishments, dance halls, and brothels. By 1878, there were 700 residents and 47 of them were prostitutes. The saloons were long, narrow, framed buildings with a bar on one side and a dance floor on the other. A hallway with several small rooms was in the rear. These rooms were rented to the customer who wanted more than a dance and for the girls who chose to entertain a man after or during working hours. Not all of these girls were prostitutes. Most earned a good salary from dancing and serving drinks. The dance was often free, but the man knew he had to buy both himself and his partner a $1 drink after each dance. The girl usually drank cold tea to stay sober. A popular girl could earn $50 an evening, half of which went to her employer. Madams were among the early entrepreneurs and made a significant contribution to the local economy. Of course, they were never accepted into society or invited to join or attend a commercial club, and in most cases were denied the protection of the law due to their profession. Collectively, their businesses employed the largest group of women on the frontier. They supplied a home for thousands of females who would have otherwise been forced to live on the streets. The majority of madams owned their own real estate and all provided a considerable amount of revenue to their city or town. They had paid property, school, and county taxes, license fees, and filled the pockets of corrupt officials and police officers. That society did not respect them, nonetheless expected them to donate generously to churches and local charities. Merchants who profited off the ladies overcharged them for liquor, food, and personal goods. A few exchanged their fancy lingerie for gingham dresses, but most died in early middle age from disease, alcoholism, drug addiction, or suicide. The term soiled doves was the polite term used for the prostitutes at this time in Dodge and throughout the West. It was the Colt revolver invented in the 1830s that was the gun of choice for shooting up towns and people. It had a rotating cylinder holding a bullet in each of 6 chambers and was rapid fire since there was no reloading between shots. It was really 6 guns in one, so it was called a 6-gun or 6-shooter. After several revisions, it came to be known as the Colt 45 Peacemaker. There we go. See someone familiar there? Which became the favorite weapon of marshals, sheriffs, and gunslinging outlaws. It was said that the Colt made all men equal. Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson staked their lives on the 45. Some had their 45s custom built. Bat Masterson had his nickel plated with special sights and gutta-percha handles, and then demanded easy on the trigger. Some were adept to give it a hair trigger action. Wyatt Earp was asked why he had a custom of keeping 5 bullets in a gun equipped for 6. His answer was 5 was all a top-notch gunfire ever fired anyhow, so the answer is merely safety to ensure against accidental discharge of the gun. The hammer always rested on an empty first chamber. Not only the professional gunfighters, but the Texas cowboys as well. In fact, virtually every man in Dodge carried 2 guns, one on either hip. These were positioned according to the length of his reach. The mythical account of shooting from the hip with both barrels blazing simultaneously rarely happened. The second gun was carried simply as a reserve if the first was emptied. They might both be drawn at once, but not fired together because even the best of gunmen could not concentrate on aiming and firing both at once with any degree of accuracy. Sorry if that disturbs your mythology. The end of Dodge City's time as a cow town came quickly and with little fanfare. Still in the early years of the 1880s, the cattle boom continued. More than 300,000 head arrived in Dodge in 1884. but because of the Texas fever outbreak, the Kansas governor imposed an embargo on further drives of longhorns into Kansas. And by 1885, the cowboy himself was all but gone. Another factor was that sheep were now grazing on hundreds of thousands of acres who ate and trampled the range grass. Add to this the homesteading farmers who had moved into the plains. The barbed wire, which had been invented in 1873, was everywhere, marking out small exclusive domains which collectively covered 100,000 acres where cattle could not trespass. The range was no longer open. Hog raising began to take the place of cattle raising, and in 1886, 186 carloads of hogs were shipped from Dodge. Also, those prairies around Dodge that used to be the home of the buffalo were now fields of grain, and flour was being shipped from the Dodge depot. Dodge was becoming known as the Buckle on the Kansas wheat belt. In March 1885, Kansas passed new laws prohibiting the sale and consumption of alcoholic beverages. In Dodge, that was like denying man the bread of life. So violent was Dodge's opposition to the law, and so flagrantly did the saloon stay open, that the state attorney general came to look the situation over. His conclusion was flattering, that Dodge City had an individuality all its own and could not be subjected to the rules of government applied to ordinary towns. But in that same year, Bat Masterson returned to Dodge, surprisingly, at the head of an army of prohibition agents, and closed down the saloons. The great names of the past, the Long Branch, the Alhambra, the Lady Gay, the Alamo, the Green Front, and the Lone Star saloons, were closed forever. In 1886, 3 different fires broke out that essentially destroyed the business district along Front Street, which included the famed Long Branch Saloon. Oops, nope, sorry. We'll just stay there. The destruction of the buildings from the city's early years signaled a transition to something new, and these original establishments were not rebuilt. They were replaced by brick buildings, and with that, Front Street lost a bit of its frontier character for something a bit more mainstream. Looking at this picture, this is your Arkansas River, this is the south, that's the north. This is what was called the dead line, which separated the two areas. And then we have Wright's, the wholesale company here, Long Branch Saloon, the Alamo was a saloon, the Alhambra was a saloon. We have an opera house. Wright House was a hotel. Here's your doctor's office. You can see up here we have residence, a First Union Church, more resident. You can tell by the designations what was up there. Down here, we got Wyatt Earp shot somebody. We got Dora Hand was murdered here. Ed Masterson was killed here. There's a lot of killing. And we have some things up here. There's so many characters I'd love to tell you about them all, but just can't do that. But anyhow, that's what you would see if you went to Dodge at that time. Dodge City had a resurrection in 1955 with the TV show Gunsmoke that aired for 20 years. Who could forget the opening scene in the early run of the show with Matt Dillon gunning down a gunslinger in the dusty Front Street, I would imagine. Marshal Dillon was laid back, tried to avoid conflicts, but was tough when he needed to be, was patterned after Wyatt Earp. So, was Miss Kitty of the Long Branch Saloon a madam for a house of prostitution? The short answer is yes. James Arness, who played Matt Dillon, explained in an interview that in the radio series she was, but after the first couple of seasons, they decided to drop those references to make the show more family friendly. And so Miss Kitty became just a lady saloon owner. Today, Dodge City is a town with a population of 27,500. It celebrates its past with a recreated Old West Street, gunfight reenactments, and historic buildings. Tourism is a big draw and a major contributor to the town's coffers, replacing the gambling, drinking, and dare I say, whoring revenues of